All right, so let's get started. Well, hello everybody, and welcome to the season finale of the Global Citizen Assembly Network, or GLOCAN's June seminar series entitled Realizing Global Public Deliberation. GLOCAN is headquartered at the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the University of Canberra. And our center is based in the beautiful land of the Ngunnawal people. And so I'd like to begin our discussion by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land where our center and GLOCAN are based, and paying respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. As scholars and advocates of deliberative democracy here in Canberra, we have the incredible privilege of learning from more than 65,000 years of Indigenous knowledge and practice of deliberation and collective decision-making. And so I invite you, wherever you are in the world, to take a moment and honor one of the richest and oldest continuing deliberative cultures in the world. Our season finale asks one of the most critical questions in global public deliberation. How can global citizens' assemblies make an impact on global governance? This session is recorded, and if you are like me, who made very poor life choices and missed our previous seminars, please keep an eye on our LinkedIn page and our YouTube channel, because we are uploading the recording of both the conversation and the Q&A. So that means if you don't want to be recorded, please turn your cameras off. So let's get to know the people on the panel today. I am moderating this panel. My name is Nicole Corato. I'm a professor at the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance. I'm the founder and co-lead of GLOCAN with Melissa Ross, who's joining us from Bremen. Also working behind the scenes is Ferdinand Sanchez, our research assistant here in Canberra. And without him, none of us can make anything happen, actually. And joining us from the UK is Aish or Aish Machani. So Aish, please introduce yourself. Tell us what you're working on. I know you're an overachiever and you're working on so many different things, but can you please tell us what you're working on that's related to the seminar today?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Nicole, for that very kind introduction. My name's Aish. I'm actually quite, I would say, new to the world of deliberative democracy. I think previously worked at the UN Foundation on global governance reform, where I was really pushing for greater leadership for young people and young countries in the multilateral system. But that's kind of when I came across the Global Assembly for COP26. And I actually did a dissertation for my master's on the extent to which the Global Assembly promoted the rights of non-human nature. Since then, I've been more integrated into the world of deliberative democracy. So I've been working at Iswe and kind of leading the work with another person to advocate for a permanent global citizens assembly. I'm also a member of GLOCAN and produced a technical paper on which was a power mapping of the UN system. And I think I'll be sharing some findings from that as it relates to docking later on in the discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you, Aish, and thank you for spending your British summer with us, if such kind of summer exists. In conversation with Aish is Antoine Vergne. Antoine is joining us from Germany. Antoine, tell us about your work.
Yes, hello everyone. I'm working at Mission Publique. We are a team of 15, and we work on governance with and for citizens, so deliberative processes. I, for myself, entered that universe in 1998, so it's been a while, as I discovered a pamphlet under pseudonym from someone advocating to randomly select the member of the French Parliament. And I was thinking, oh, that's an interesting idea. And then I did my study on that. I did my PhD on that. And since 2011, I work on designing and implementing such processes with Mission Publique.
Right, perfect. Thank you both for the introductions. So let's get started. In the title of the seminar, we actually use the term docking, or docking global citizens' assemblies with institutions of global governance. So Aish, let's start with you. What does docking mean in your work? How do you use that concept?
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. So I think the word docking, I think it has a broad definition, but I'd loosely define it as a connection to formal power. And I think the way that I would see it is that this is docking as a kind of one possible route to impact. I think maybe worth clarifying that docking does not necessarily mean impact. So if you dock with an institution of global governance, it doesn't automatically lead to impact. I think, and two other nuances, given that we're talking about the global level, is that docking at a global level is slightly more complicated because in global governance, as I'm sure you're aware, there's not an executive power holder where if you docked with that, for example, the SG is not the Secretary General of the UN. The Secretary General is not the same person that then would implement the recommendations that came out of a Global Citizens Assembly. That kind of comes up to the member states and the UN organizations and other actors. So so this issue of connections to formal power, I think, have become more complicated at the global level because you have to think very carefully about where power lies and where you want to connect to it in a formal way. And the other thing is maybe just to say that I think docking also, I would say it shouldn't be conflated with looking for a kind of political mandate or commissioning from an international organization, because I think, again, because of this complication of executive power in the global governance system, is that we, I think, wouldn't want to connect to an international organization and then say, whatever recommendations come out of this, it's up to you to implement them. It's just kind of one way of connecting, and I think we can discuss this later, but around this connection point, you'd want to be putting in other like avenues for impact. Sorry, that was quite waffly, but please feel free to ask any clarifying questions.
No, absolutely. I really like that you put power at the center of your definition of docking, and you did a brilliant paper for the Global Citizens Assembly Network on power mapping with the United Nations. So can you give us a sense of where are the spaces for power and connecting Global Citizens Assembly in the UN system?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think the finding from my paper was that the ultimate power of the UN, despite its efforts in the previous decades to open up its doors to other actors, still lies with its member states. So this is like 196 member states, each with their own agenda that will that makes it quite difficult to find one source of power. That's not to say that the UN Secretariat or some of the other UN entities don't have significant power, but I think the ultimate power still lies with member states. And I think, I mean, there's still like space for influencing these member states, or there's still space for connecting and influencing these member states, even though they are quite disparate and disconnected. I can share more about that when we talk a bit maybe about kind of advocacy and influencing.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for creating that opening, Aish. Antoine, let's turn to you. To what extent do you agree with Aish's definition of docking, or in your work with Missions Publiques, how do you appreciate this concept?
Yeah, thanks a lot. So I took notes, and there was my first word was docking is part of impact. So completely aligned with what you say, Aish. And I think, to build on what you said, I think it's between influence and institutionalization. It's because first, it's the smallest part of the iceberg, because what is underneath is all of the impacts on the people, on the partners, on the capacity building. So there are a lot of impacts that are not captured by docking. And as you said, I agree completely. It's not because you have docking that you have impact, and the contrary. You can have a lot of impact without official docking. And I would put it really between influence and institutionalization, something in between. And I would see it as a process, something which is not, we have to build, and it's a long process, and it's a continuous process. So it's you're never done or landed with docking. I think it's because each time you attack a new topic, you attack a new ecosystem, a new system of people that are negotiating, people that are in that ecosystem or bubble, And so you have to start from the beginning doing the case. So I think that's, yeah.
Can you give us an example in the work that you've done of successful docking that generated impact?
Yeah, I can do that after. I have prepared a couple of images to share on what happened in the past years, but with pleasure. I can do that in the next round.
Yeah, please give us the example now. Let's not give any cliffhangers.
Oh, really? Because, okay,
Yeah.
so then I'll...
Maybe a small example.
No, okay, so, let's keep the cliffhanger for the next question.
All right, then I'll turn to Aish then. Aish, can you give us an example of a successful kind of docking for a global citizen deliberation, not necessarily a citizens assembly format, but good practices of docking civil society engagement in global governance that actually made a difference?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very good question. I don't want to be very cynical about it, but I think there's not a huge number of examples where I think citizen deliberation on a global level, especially led by the UN, has been massively impactful. But maybe I'll just point to one example, which is, I think, docking in a way that we wouldn't necessarily traditionally think about it, where it's docking to a key moment in the international calendar rather than an institution. So in 2020, it was the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, and a group of civil society organizations, kind of in partnership with several UN agencies, ran a global conversation with to kind of understand from people what their views on the UN systems, on the UN's progress had been over 75 years, and what priorities the UN should be focusing on in the next, I guess, 75 years or so. And I think what was interesting about that was the process didn't necessarily say, you know, once this conversation is held, it will lead to XYZ impact. But what it did do is, because it created such a buzz around the UN 75th anniversary, it meant that the member states of the United Nations basically had to recognize that these demands were coming out from civil society, and the outcomes were then kind of incorporated into a member state declaration in which they announced new priorities, many of which were the ones that came out of the global conversation with civil society.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think this is such a really useful distinction as well when we talk about docking and impact, because at least before this conversation, I tend to equate the two, right? If it's docked, then it should have impact. But actually, you're clarifying this for all of us, that something can be docked but not have an impact. Something can have an impact but not properly docked. We don't have to dock to institutions in particular. Processes can be docked to particular moments. So there's a lot of rich learning there, but that we have to process. But I want to shift gears a bit and talk about, let's just say, where we are in terms of the global community's appreciation for global citizen deliberation, or global processes of deliberation, or global citizen engagement processes that have elements of deliberation. Where is the global community at? And I thought, Antoine, I want to bring you in this conversation because you've been in this space for a long time. And I remember our very, very early conversations about possibilities of global citizen deliberation. And now you can't even count it with your hands, the number of global processes that you've done, right, on the global level. So my question is, where is the global community at the moment when it comes to their appreciation for the impact and docking of global citizen deliberation? Let's say in the case of technocrats, decision makers, elected representatives, is there increasing enthusiasm for these kinds of assemblies? Is there more skepticism compared to 10 years ago? What are the openings that you see?
Yeah, thanks. So I'd like to share something with you, because as you asked me to make it, what is my impression? And I was thinking, okay, I'm gonna go back and look at what happened and about docking and impact. And it brings us back to 2012. And that's me in front of the Élysée Palace, which is where the French president at the time was François Hollande in 2012. And we were there to advocate to dock a global process of deliberation on biodiversity, and that was the the worldwide views on biodiversity that we were doing with the Danish Board of Technologies at that time. So we managed to have 25 countries and 3,000 people, and no docking at national level. So France was absolutely not in a position to say yes to such a thing. But so that's on the process. On the left, you see the people that had candidated. So in each of the location, we asked the people if they wanted to be part of the delegation of citizens who were going to go to the COP in Hyderabad. It was in Hyderabad, the COP on biodiversity. And we had a delegation of citizens and stakeholders there, and we advocated for having the recognition of citizen participation and the results of the worldwide views into the process of the COP. So we were there a week trying to liaise and to advocate. And at the end, that's the sentence, you see it. There is a results report on worldwide views and biodiversity. So that was our docking, our impact. On the document, you see it of 288 pages. We had half a line in the annex. So that was a strong impact. But it showed us that you can try to do something at global level on global deliberation. So we went on. And we went on with the worldwide views on climate. So you can recognize Bjorn from the Danish Board of Technologies and many other partners. And we tried to have, again, a process of global deliberation, which was a bit bigger in 2015. And we managed to have an official cooperation with UNFCCC so that we were included in many of the activities. We were invited to all negotiation before the COP in Paris. And we even had a high-level event with the Secretary General of UNFCCC at that time. And we were able to testify in different parliaments around the world and to have meetings with different groups of countries. And we were even allowed, which was a very big thing at that time, to put the reports, so you see the reports of worldwide views on all the tables of all the delegations. So the 196 countries were informed about the results by having the report. And then we also did some advocacy to have that word, because it's really about putting the word citizens somewhere in one text. And why it is important is because if you don't do that, you can then refer to it and you can then again dock it and say, okay, look, citizens could be part of it. So what we did was to try to put that word into it every time we could. And if you look at the Paris Agreement and you look for the word citizens in the Paris Agreement, there is no match. So that didn't work. Our docking was not very effective. Our impact was not very effective on that process, but it didn't stop us to having other impacts, which, as we said at the beginning, is not the topic today. After that, we tried to change the ecosystem. And so, Nicole, when you were talking about different ecosystem and we're talking about starting from scratch, we started from scratch. That topic was internet. So we went to all international events that were about internet and internet governance. And we tried again, and this time we gathered a coalition of governments, international institutions, and private sector too. And we did again a dialogue, but this time we phrased it, or we positioned it as a test, improvement, and institutionalization. So not saying from the beginning it's the end game, but it's a process. So what I was saying at the beginning, docking is a process. You need to test, you need to improve, and then when you've done it, you can be sure and institutionalize. We had a very nice timeline until 2025. And if you look at 2025, the plan is, I don't know, to have a deliberative stakeholders and citizens dialogue as part of the internet governance. So institutionalization at the end of the process, we are still not that far. And for all, COVID came in between and put a bit of timing in our plan. So everything went online. We were able to deploy the dialogues in the countries. And Ash, to what you were saying, it's interesting because we also had in parallel a stakeholders dialogue. So it was not a dialogue of randomly selected citizens, but of stakeholders in 80 countries of the world. And indeed, the process was about the reform of the internet governance. And that process is the results of what you have. So on the right are the results of what the stakeholders dialogue did. And on the left, this is the official option paper that was presented by Germany and the United Arab Emirates to the UN Secretariat on how internet governance should look like. And if you look, it's almost one-to-one. So that is a strong impact and quite a talking, but it's a stakeholders dialogue. So that's, and then we went on. 2022, another example, and here we have the contrary. We have a very strong institutionalization, which was the Conference on the Future of Europe. And here we can say that the docking was very integrated because it was the three institutions. And at the end of the process, as many of you know, there was that big event with the presidency of the European Union through France, of the Parliament and of the Commission, and they took the recommendations. So here it's a process, but this one was commissioned by the three bodies. So it's a very big difference, but very big docking. So in the future, what we do, we have plans on oceans, on AI, on genome, on climate, you know that. So there are many, many things that can be done. But what are the learnings? The learnings is that you need people and projects. You need people who work on it, and that's what we are doing now. And I will show you the difference between 2012 and 2024. And you need projects because the only way to do to progress is to say we have already done it. So when you go to the UN and say we want to do something that has never been done before, that's a problem. If you say, don't worry, we do something that has been done many times, it's less a problem. Where are we at? So your question, Nicole, 2012, 2024. People, we had in 2012 not that many people and not that many projects. It's very different now. So my feeling is, yes, we have a big difference. Okay, I'll screw that. That's two. But what is important is to zoom out a bit because we have a very different situation now, but that very different situation is also a long process. So if you take the French CA on climate, it has something before that has inspired it, and itself, it has inspired many things and was supported by many things. And you can even, don't know whatever, but you can even zoom more, because if you zoom more on time, you can go back to the 60s and having the planning cells and citizen stories. So for me, talking is really progressing, and that's the conclusion. In 2012, no one knew about it, and you could go and say, okay, we are going to do a citizens deliberation, and you were thinking, what is that? 2015 was rather the question of, okay, ooh, is that a good idea? In 19, people started to hear about it, and I hope that in some years, people will just wait for the results.
All right, thank you, Antoine. That is such an illuminating insight into how docking, impact, institutionalization are very much a multi-year, if not multi-decadal projects. So yes, thanks for that presentation. Aish, I'd like to turn to you because like what you said a while ago when you introduced yourself, you were really in this space even before you started working on your advocacy on a permanent citizens assembly. So what I want to learn from you actually is you have this impressive work that you've done as convener of the Next Generation Fellows, which also contributed to our common agenda of the United Nations. What is the difference, do you think, when you are campaigning for a permanent citizens assembly on the global level compared to the other campaigns that you've worked on? What are the key lessons so far? You don't have to show us a picture of yourself in 2012.
Yeah, I think actually, sadly, there's not that much difference, but that's for another conversation. But I mean, yeah, it's a really great question. I think my answer is, I guess, going to be somewhat related to what Antoine has already said, but a lot of the ideas that we were getting from young people and that we then tried to put forward and for the Our Common Agenda project were ideas that had already reached a fairly high degree of maturity in the international system. So young people were calling for a UN Youth Office or for more radical reform on the of education system globally. But this was not, these were ideas that had been around, over a decade and been pushed for by many people. So when it came to our work of amalgamating ideas and putting them forward for the Secretary General's team, we were really just taking advantage of a window of opportunity, and we weren't starting from the bottom up. Whereas some of the work that we're doing to advocate for a permanent global citizens assembly, it really does feel like we're starting from the bottom up. And I think to Antoine's point, there is definitely much more. It feels like awareness of citizen deliberation at the global level than there was maybe a few years ago. But the idea of a global citizens assembly as a permanent piece of global governance infrastructure is still, I think, quite novel with actors in the UN, even if it's not a novel idea in academia and in culture. The UN is, I think this is something that I explore in my paper, an organization which is very much built on representation. So member states act as representatives of their constituents, or civil societies, organizations act as representatives of particular stakeholder groups. The idea of directly engaging citizens, I think, is still very new. So that means that the approach that we've had to take is quite different, I think, to if you were working with ideas that were more mature. So it means that, for example, we've had to start with quite a lot of actual just thought leadership and introducing the idea slowly. So we've been working with quite established UN focused think tanks, such as the UN Foundation, Southern Voice, and Plataforma CIPO, for example, to put out a challenge paper that analyzes the history of citizen engagement at the UN and makes a case for strengthening citizen participation at the UN. And this is not, we didn't have to really start. This is stuff that had already been done when we were looking at things like a UN Youth Office or a Transforming Education Summit and things like that. So we produced a challenge paper. I can share that in the chat. We've also had to kind of go about creating a and I think another thing that Antoine kind of pointed out is that if we are going to be putting in projects or things like that, we have to design with impact in mind from the very beginning, because there is a certain degree of skepticism, I think, amongst UN actors about the idea of citizen deliberation, as I said, because it's an organization that's so based on representation. So this idea of impact has been really, really on our minds as we've been going into the advocacy strategy. And it's not unlike we can't take a gamble. It has to be something that is it can't be performative. It has to have a high impact. So for example, we've been thinking about a global citizens assembly for COP30, and in designing that, we've been thinking about what are the kind of framing questions that we can put forward that are going to be relevant for the moments that come out for the COP30 moment. And I think this then has raised quite interesting questions about who sets agendas, and that was discussed at a previous GLOCAN seminar. We've also recognizing that we're not going to get a formal mandate from the UN because it's such a novel idea, and because we're not going to get the approval from 196 member states, we've actually been working to build a coalition for a global citizens assembly. So that brings together a few UN member states and a few UN organizations and a number of civil society organizations. I think this idea of putting together a coalition around a global citizens assembly that includes member states and UN organizations might also raise some interesting questions about, is this a new type of docking? It's building infrastructure around the citizens assembly in parallel to the existing institutions rather than docking on to the existing institutions. Yeah.
Is that shift already official on the part of your advocacy, that you are prioritizing coalition building as you recognize that the mandate from the UN will not happen, at least in the next few years?
Yeah, so I think the way that we're seeing it is kind of as I alluded to in a previous bit, is that I don't think we feel like we're going to get docking to the UN as an organization in the next 5-10 years. So what we're trying to do is build this infrastructure around the coalition around the Global Citizens Assembly, and instead dock using moments, as I said before. So COP30 as one, but next year is also going to be this big World Social Summit that's talking about the progress that we've seen on the Sustainable Development Goals. So it is a slightly different approach, and docking is part of it, but maybe not docking in the traditional sense.
Right. Well, thank you, Aish. We are now ready to get questions from the audience. So just please raise your hand. Are we still? Okay, so I can just see okay, so just please raise your virtual hand or turn on your camera so you can appear at the top of my screen. But while waiting, maybe we can get a reaction from Antoine based on what Aish said. Do you share the same strategy, or are you still directly working with UN institutions? What openings do you see there?
No, it's I completely agree. The coalition strategies where we learned from what were used in 15, because in 15 we came with that. Okay, we had an official partnership with UNFCCC, which is the main stakeholder in climate. So that was actually there was a backing. They were a co-organizer, but it doesn't mean that we had impact. So we came with that narrative of we are going to do a very nice citizen deliberation, which people from the world are going to tell you, we know how it works, random selection, blah, blah, blah. And then nothing happened. So we switched completely and we said, okay, what you need to do is start by building a coalition of actors that want to receive the results. And that's why we did that with the internet. Crossed with what you were saying, Aish, was the momentum. So we knew that the internet governance system was going to be reformed. I mean, it's going to finish next year, the last moment. So 2020 was a good moment to dock to a process which was ongoing of discussion. And then we started by building that coalition, which took a lot of time. But it was then asked the stakeholder, okay, what are the questions you really need to get answers from citizens on your governance topic? And that changed the dynamic because you had the people on board, because you had that multi-stakeholder coalition, and then at the end that made it possible for UNESCO or for others to get on board of that process and to be part as the UN system. And also the UN Secretary General was through UN 75, one of the partner too. But that was because we had a strong coalition from the beginning, not because we had an official partnership with the UN only.
And when you build these coalitions, what is it that they find the most persuasive about global citizen deliberation? Is it the everyday citizens bit? Is it the deliberation bit? Is it the diversity? What is, Aish, from your experience, what is the most persuasive arguments when you try to bring in people in your coalition?
It depends, which is a very cop-out answer, but it really depends on who we're approaching. So I think, and I don't want to generalize too much here, but for a lot of the civil society organizations we've been speaking to, some of the big ones, I think they fundamentally believe in the normative value of having citizens involved in conversations that will affect their future. So for those organizations, the cell feels quite like a bit easier. For UN organizations and member states, I think it would be harsh to say that they don't believe in the normative value of citizen participation, but we do have to occasionally use instrumental arguments as well. So for the Executive Office of the Secretary General, for example, we might say having a global citizens assembly connected to the UN would help to rebuild trust in the multilateral system. Or for member states, we would say something like, it's a way of demonstrating your commitment to participation and inclusivity, and or to advance your goals for global governance reform. So we have to use, I think, often a variety of arguments, and I think depending on who we're speaking to, essentially.
Right. And what about skeptics? What are the common reasons that you hear from people who don't want to join your coalition?
So again, skepticism comes from a range of people. So for civil society organizations, they would either see it as a concern because because they feel like it could be tokenistic, because they've experienced previous initiatives organized by the UN, or around the UN where people have been consulted and the results haven't gone anywhere. So there's this, we hear often comments about consultation fatigue or exhaustion, things like that. Or there could be skepticism because it treads on their toes as representatives of a particular stakeholder group. As I said, the UN is very much revolves around this idea of people being represented by stakeholder representatives, things like that. If it's with member states, it can either be because it feels like it's threatening to an existing form of with member states, two arguments as well. So you have often from like very democratic states concerns that it threatens electoral democracy, or it tries to supersede that process, or and some from other states there's also the concern that giving citizens a voice in global governance can only lead to trouble. And that's not often what we hear, but occasionally we'll hear that member states should be leading everything at the UN.
Right, thank you. We are still accepting questions. Just please raise your virtual hand if you have a question. Antoine, do you share the same experience with skepticisms and support when it comes to coalition building?
Yes. A couple of things. I think so. For civil society, it's funny because in 2013, 14, before COP21, they were the most resistant to the idea, because they were saying we are representing the people, so there is no sense of asking them. And I remember having a very long, very constructive discussion with the head of the Russian delegation, and he was saying, okay, that's a good idea, we should do that. And with Greenpeace just after saying, no way we do that. So it was quite counterintuitive for me, but that has changed a lot. So what you say, Aish, is indeed civil society now has really there is a 180% change on that, and that's interesting because for me this added value has been I think seen by civil society, and on the skeptics, I think it's the exact same as arguments that you see at the municipal level or state level. I mean, it's really about competency. Are people really competent about the topic? You will have biases because the people that will come are not everyday people, and you will have biases. How to make sure that the results are good? And maybe one, so that I see no difference on the argumentation that you can see elsewhere. And on the way to convince, it's a difficult one, because what you want to do is to tell the people, okay, you are going to be part of a coalition on an open process. You don't know the results, so you control nothing on the results, but you are going to have them, and you are going to need to react and acknowledge those results and do something with them. And I can tell you that's a difficult number to sell, of course.
Right, yeah, it's always the question, what if they get at the wrong answer? What do we do?
Exactly.
Sergey, yes, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for organizing this event, and the discussion is incredibly valuable. And I think Antoine was reading my mind and I was typing the question. You brought up some of the member states who are not channeling the whole spectrum of citizens' views through the UN processes. And Russia and Iran are just some of the examples of sort of non-representation of their citizens' views through the UN processes. So I wonder if the global citizens' assemblies can serve as a complementary or an alternative source of channeling the dissenting voices in from countries that are either with limited civic space or with where the civic space is absent, particularly on climate-related issues.
Expecting to see you here.
That's a great question. Now citizens' assemblies can really start making trouble. Antoine, do you want to start?
And actually,
yeah, our experience with that is very interesting. So we never talk about democracy when we do that kind of processes. We talk about citizen deliberation, citizen participation or engagement, which is our first line of defense. And then indeed so we managed, for example, in 2015, we had a group in Russia, we had 2 or 3 groups in China. In 2020, we had Russia, we had Yemen, so you can do it, it happens. But sometimes it also does not happen. For with the internet, 1 week before the event, we had the Secret Service in Egypt coming and saying, okay, no, you are not going to do it. So it happens also that it is being blocked. And our partners in Egypt had to stop the process. The same thing happened in Syria in 2020. So you have places where it is difficult indeed to do. In 2015, we also had Iran, for example, as one of the partners, and we had the results and everything. What is interesting is, I think when you talk about dissenting, it's not, I wouldn't say dissenting is what the people in the country think also as other citizens. And that's why it becomes interesting, because if you look the results, for example, of 2015 in Russia and China about climate, on fossil fuel, phasing out, in Russia, the majority of the people were to phase out coal very quickly and oil very slowly, but phase out. And in China, people were very big majority to phase out oil very fast and coal not that fast, but also phasing out. So what you see the cultural and implication, and that the people know their surrounding and economic surroundings, but they were agreeing on phasing out, just they had very different priorities. That's for the results and voices that you can include through that. And I forgot, I had another. Yeah, maybe my favorite story of impact on what you were asking, Sergey, is after World War II, 3 years later, I met a person who at the time of the COP21 was head of the UK delegation. And we talked, and he told me, yeah, of course, I know what you did with World War II. Because for me, I took the report in each of my bilateral meetings with other countries and member states, and I opened the report at the page where we had the results of the country, and I showed them, look, the people of your country, that's what they think about the climate and climate change. So you should follow what your people do. So it's soft diplomacy, but it's very invisible. You don't see it, and it was pure random that I met that guy 3 years later who did that. So, but there is something.
Right, thanks for that. Actually, one of the PhD students that we know from GLOCAN, Hong Do, is working exactly on this topic, on how global citizens' assemblies can actually give voice to people in authoritarian states. And now she's working on people in stateless people, on how they can actually get a voice in global governance through global citizens' assemblies. It's a normative argument that she's making. Aish, is there anything you want to add to that?
No, I think echoing quite a lot of what Antoine said. I think, again, we use a quite similar strategy of not using the word democracy, which is not as universal, whereas cultures of deliberation are universal and feel less threatening when we're talking to, I guess, authoritarian countries. And the 2021 Global Assembly, we did have participants from China, for example. I think maybe the only thing I would add is, so far, it's been relatively uncomplicated to get participation from people from authoritarian countries, because in some ways, because of the limited impact. I feel like the more power and impact these processes gain, the more likely they are to be attacked by skeptics or be restricted.
Right, thank you. Heidi, do you want me to read your question, or do you want to? Yes, please, Heidi, go ahead.
I'm happy to say it, and thank you. This is a fascinating conversation. I work in community engagement with global health, and I suppose one of the things that I've been really interested by is, I think we're getting more interest from people we're working with as participants in understanding the impact of their contributions, their impact, and also I guess of some fatigue around that. And I just wondered where this conversation about docking, whether it does feature, whether people are asking questions in assemblies themselves about how does this become institutionalized? How does this have impact? How do we create influence? Whether there's been any sort of shift in the nature of that kind of conversation.
Right, Antoine, let's start with you because you've done so many of these processes.
No, I think I would see for that, again, kind of fractal. People participating in the city have the same question and they say, okay, what is the city council doing with what we say? But you have the same, what is the UN going to do with what we say? Or what is the European Union Commission going to do? So I don't see a very big difference. But of course, the arguments, because if you work with a city and they commission it, it's different on that sense, because you don't have to do the argument. If you are working as a coalition, it's kind of the argumentation coming from within the coalition. Say, we as a coalition are going to acknowledge what you are going to do. So it's very important. What we do is normally have those welcoming words at the beginning of the process by stakeholders saying, okay, you're here because we as a coalition have invited you and we want you to tell us what you think, and we are going to. So it's a self-commissioning story. But the people, they always have the question.
Right. Aish?
Yeah, I mean, I think others on this call from Iswe, Sarah and Claire will be able to speak to this more, but I'll give an attempt at an answer, and Heidi, we can always continue this conversation offline. But I think I would say that it is of interest to participants, and it was also, I think, a particular interest to the cluster facilitators and community organizations that we worked with in the 2021 Global Assembly about what would happen with the results. And I think it's something that we're increasingly conscious of, as we're not just trying to do a one-shot Global Citizens Assembly, but a permanent Global Citizens Assembly, for us to make sure that we're not letting down either participants or the community organizations that we're working with. So I think we're trying from the very beginning to make sure that we're including those voices in designing how the assembly runs and what its potential impact would be, because I think, yeah, we are very conscious about this issue of consultation fatigue. But as I said, yeah, Sarah and Claire might be able to elaborate more on the experiences of the experience of people who participated in the first Global Assembly.
Right, thank you. Of course, Claire and Sarah, feel free to jump in, but I don't see any virtual hands, so let me just take advantage of your expertise as well. Oh, Mel, go ahead, please.
No, I don't want to interrupt, so please pose your question and I can go after.
Go
Okay.
ahead.
Yeah, thanks so much. I mean, I feel like I'm abusing a little bit the space, but thank you so much for what you've shared so far. But I was thinking some of your insights, right? Differentiating docking from impact and the long work of building coalitions, of soft diplomacy, as you mentioned, Antoine. It all feels very slow to me. And at the same time, and I believe that's the very reason why most of us are doing this kind of work or researching this kind of work or being activists in this space, is because, well, the world is on fire and some problems are very, very urgent and they demand urgent answers, and global governance institutions seem to be very slow themselves, and in some cases also not particularly effective in answering those questions. So I'm fishing here for some hopeful insights about, can we also do, what else can we do with global deliberation that can provide answers to these very urgent problems in shorter timelines? Thank you.
Right, Aish, do you want to give that a go?
Well, I would say specifically about the campaigning and advocacy side of it is that, yes, I think it is quite slow, but I guess the good news is, because of the work of lots of other organizations, we aren't at ground zero now. And I think often a lot of these campaigns hit a kind of tipping point where then change happens very, very quickly. So as I said, I gave the example of the fact that young people were calling for a UN youth office for a really long time. It then suddenly, once the kind of window of opportunity opened, and there was a UN youth office established within a year. So I think and maybe this is too optimistic, but I feel like the window of opportunity is close. It doesn't feel as far as it did, even looking back at studies from a few years ago, for things like global deliberation to kind of to become part of the mainstream of conversations in global governance.
Right. Antoine?
Yeah, I have the same feeling. It's accelerating. So if you really look at what was there 10 years ago and now, it's a very huge difference. But another story, when we did the climate assembly in France, it was the first time that my grandmother told me, "Yeah, Antoine, no, I finally know what to do," because 70% of the French population knew what it was, how it was working, and what it was doing, which was completely new. I mean, even 3 years before. So I think there is an acceleration, and I'm quite hopeful that we may reach the tipping point at many levels, and that's yeah. So, but indeed, I mean, the pace is always the problem. You would like for it to be even quicker, but that's yeah.
That's a good indicator. Yeah, that's a good indicator. My father now knows what I do, so I think that's also a good indicator. But I think, yeah, just actually building on what Mel said, because we've been talking about how to dock global citizens' assemblies on institutions of global governance. But one of the interests of GLOCAN as well is how to dock them or connect these assemblies to the hyper-local level, where impact can be faster, more felt, more grounded. I wonder what sorts of reflections you both have in relation to, instead of going up, connecting up, to also ground these assemblies. Antoine, do you want to go first?
Yes, here our conviction is that you need decentralized assemblies. And if you can do it, you can have a transnational level, but you need to localize the most you can, because it's where you have that, what I was talking about, the rest of the iceberg, where you have the capacity building happening, where you have the networking happening, and where you can react, you can connect, you can. So that's for me the key. The key is at the moment is how do we create those processes, and if we have also the luxury of having a direct transnational step with ambassadors, whatever the methodology. But I think, yeah, localizing is very, very, very important.
Right. Aish?
Yeah, just absolutely seconding everything Antoine said. I think it completely embedded into our theory of change as we think about a permanent global citizens assembly is not just institutional actions or policy influence, but also encouraging local citizen actions and building kind of civic infrastructure for community resilience around communities. I can actually see Claire's hand raised. I feel like she'll probably have a lot and very good stuff to say about this.
Yes, Claire, please go for it.
Well, it's a question actually, because we're talking about decentralization and grounding it in local context. But what we're hearing more and more now is the potential of translocal deliberation, because the model of decentralized assemblies and, for instance, the way World War Views was designed is that you had these localized assemblies, but they didn't support translocal deliberation. So I'm really interested in that. How could we design this? How could we make sure we don't lose that opportunity to really have engagement across the world and with different perspectives? Because that's what's missing, I think. If we don't get this core kind of citizens assembly at the global level, then we miss the potential for that.
Yes, thank you. I just noticed a question from Joe, and we have 4 minutes left. So Joe, do you want to read your question, or should I do it for you? Just unmute yourself if you want to read the question. Okay, I'll do it. Participating to several deliberation processes, I noticed that more and more often people say that what is blocking the implementation of amazing ideas to problems like global warming, environment, etc., is corporate lobbying and politicians themselves. Would you think that the last ones would see the Global Citizens Assembly as a power shift? Aish, do you want to start? And maybe also give your final thoughts before we close the seminar.
Yeah, I this is a very good question. I think yes. I think, in my opinion, if we want global citizens' assemblies to have impact, they will entail a power shift from the kind of power structures that are in play at the moment. And I think the way that to try and make this possible is to build a coalition of the willing of other politicians and lobbyists on the other side to make the case compelling. That's a very vague answer, but I'm not sure we have time to unpack quite a big question at this moment. So I think maybe just some final reflections is to say that just kind of going back, I guess, to what we said at the beginning, is that docking is really important, and I think it can be I think what we've seen is that it can take various forms, and it doesn't have to be one fixed thing, but it is also just one element of impact. And some of the stuff that we haven't touched upon, such as movement building and local community building, is also really essential to designing global citizen assembly that can help us kind of push systems change and shift power.
Perfect. Thank you, Aish. And if you want to learn more about Aish's work, she is on X and LinkedIn, right? All right, Antoine, your answer to the question and your final thoughts.
Yeah. So to clear on the translocal, I think indeed that's the next boss, we can say next level, that we need to think about. There are good practice. I think what happened in the conference on the future of Europe with that plenary, which were randomly selected members of the randomly selected citizens panels that were together with a member of the parliaments and national and European. That was a very good format because you had that connection, but you can also think about direct connection between countries during the process. I mean, it's I think there are ways, but indeed it's an important thing we need to think about. On your question, Joe, for me, marking was indeed the finish of the Citizens' Assembly on Climate in France, where for I think the last session, the citizens needed speakers, and within a week it was possible to get the head of Google Europe and the second boss of Danone, which is one of the biggest groups in the world on food. And that was interesting because for me, it was the sign or the weak signal that this particular assembly had reached the tipping point of being a place of power where people wanted to be and influence. So for me, that's going to, if we're optimistic, that's what is going to happen, that those places are going to be seen more and more places where you need to be. And then it's going to be interesting for the different multi-stakeholders to be in the process and to try to influence it. But then it's we go again, we will have new questions to solve when we are at that point.
Fantastic. Thanks, Antoine. And you can connect with Antoine on, are you still on X? But he is certainly on LinkedIn, and Mel put your profile there. Well, thank you both, Aish and Antoine, for sharing your expertise, generously sharing your stories with the group. And thank you, everybody, for joining the season finale of GLOCAN's June seminar series. We have a lot more plans for the future, but for now, we will first enjoy our summer and our winter. And thank you once again for joining us, and we hope to see you in future GLOCAN events.